speaker today. We'll do a few minutes of review while Justin comes down to continue coaching us and helping us with our congregational singing and song. And then we are going to launch into a very simple, straightforward question on how you read the book of Genesis. Or how we read the Bible in general, but specifically this question is that do we take the creation story and the flood story and all of the information there as kind of factual history or not, or somewhere in between, or how do we come at that? And so I'll do my best. I'm thankful to Carol Slade who brought up the question, so it's all on her. No, Carol, actually, before that, someone else asked, people say, do you take the Bible literally? And we've been working with that question, so it's just an offshoot of that. So it's a perfect time to stop, and as I'm trying to help you get into the Bible, and remember, our reviewing here, the whole point of this is to get you to do what? Open up that Bible and not be intimidated or, whatever, scared off by it, or not even just scared off, just know what it's about. And so just remember, we've talked about the Bible as a library. You cannot understand the Bible if you think it is a simple novel that starts with beginning to end. It is actually a collection of books. It is a library. And thus, there's lots of different kinds of literature. And so last week, we looked at the different kinds. But to sum up, how do we tell the whole overall story of the Bible? I've put before you this thought of an arrow. That God, the story of the Bible is God coming to us. And I think that'll come out clear in Genesis today. So, we showed that there were three types of literature in the Bible. Narrative story, which kind of prompted we read a little bit from the Exodus story just to get an idea of narrative. And so that may have prompted, well, wow, do we read these stories as history? How do we come at this? And then that there's poetry in the Bible. And a lot of times you can see that in the way the print is put into your English Bible. Just in a conversation before class, it's important for you to know that there's a lot of poetry in the Bible, not in the Psalms and Proverbs. There's poetry all throughout the Bible. And we also have to think of poetry not just simply as something that rhymes, but just how poetry comes at us with images, metaphor, comparisons. In oral tradition, these are ways that we can remember things. And so remember that the Bible is a lot of it oral tradition. And then finally, prose, discourse, letters, speeches, lectures, etc. All of that's in there. So that was reviewing what we did last week. Justin, come on up because we're going to be ready for you. And so that's what we did last week, and we're going to work on our congregational song with Justin. And as he's coming up, I can remind you that today we're having a lovely shower for Olivia and their new baby, Gabriel, who's also being baptized in the late service today. So we're all very excited for you guys. So I want to invite you, come. You're welcome. It's an open invitation to all. It's not just for women. Yeah, that's important because I'm going to be there. First time. All right, Scott's going to be there. And the wonderful chefs in my household, Katie and Sandy, and then Nana helped out with the sprinkles, made homemade cupcakes, like 100 of them. And I was the quality control. All right, Justin, please.
Okay, well, today we're moving from the beginning of the service toward the table. And this is the Sanctus. Holy, 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 Lord God Almighty. Heaven and earth are full of your glory. Blessed be your name. Now, this one has some fun stuff. It's almost like a round. And one of the other settings I've written actually uses a round as the holy, holy. And that's because this is a song that's already happening that we join in. This is the song of the angels. And where is it coming from? Isaiah.
Isaiah, yes, Isaiah chapter 6.
That's right. I knew that. I was just making sure you guys were doing it.
I passed the test, Isaiah chapter 6, the call of Isaiah. He sees the heavens open, and what's happening in heaven is, yes,
The angels singing glory to God. So, the melody we've been singing is, again, it's another one of those melodies that makes us men not sound all that good. So we won't sing it long. Holy, 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 holy Lord. Right? Which is a great melody, and it's really wonderful for sopranos. The guy's part here is, I did something kind of different with this one. So the guys are going to say words that everybody else doesn't get to say. So see the bottom part here. So we got holy, 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 holy. Can you get your beer mug going already, right? There's the bass part. And then you wait. The basses get a big break to refill. And then they go, heaven and earth are full of your glory, blessed three in one. So where the stems go up, that's the tenor part. Stems go down, that's the bass part. So here, at that holy, this one, the basses don't sing that. So remember, you gotta take your time, take your break to refill. So let's sing that bass part. Basses. Here we go. With the voices. Holy, 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 holy. Wait. Heaven and earth are full of your glory, blessed three in one. Right? So that's your nice comfortable spot down there to sing. Now the tenors, all the pop stars are tenors, all the rock stars are tenors, and that's fine. They get to say the things that nobody else says. Lord God Almighty. So they take their break first, and then they come in later. Here, holy, holy, Lord God Almighty, and that's kind of that's the rock star part there. And it happens where the soprano is holding. So let's try that again. Holy, holy, Lord God Almighty, and then they get to wait. And then the big rock star part here. Full of your glory, blessed three in one. Pretty cool, huh? I think it is. Yeah, a little partial. Okay, so you go, the basses start. Holy, 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 Lord God Almighty. Heaven and earth are full of your glory, blessed three in one. Yeah, so that's the interlocking, people are jumping in, they're joining in, as it were, with the song of the birds. Now, altos always get the prettiest part, if you ask me. And it starts on the tonic. Holy, 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 holy Lord, heaven and earth are full of your glory, blessed three in one. And then the last time we sing it, you get the sharp note, that happy one. Let's sing the altos. Sing the alto part with me. Holy, 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 holy Lord, heaven and earth are full of your glory, blessed three in one. Yeah, pretty good, altos. Well, take it. This? Yeah, I was not. So I had something like hearing very close. I'm like, fine screaming at everybody or not?
Justin's had a ear infection. He didn't know last time.
It's getting better now. Last Sunday I was in a tunnel. It was terrible. Okay, let's try it. Now, has everybody, do you get the Facebooks and the SoundClouds and all that stuff? This one we just recorded 2 weeks ago with our choir at choir practice, and then I added a bunch of stuff. So the recording that you can hear on SoundCloud of this song is our choir, making their internet debut.
Nice.
It sounds pretty good, really.
So I'm trying to think when we put that in last or sent that out last. But
It was
maybe
in the e-news this week.
it was in the e-news this last week. So if you go back to your Tuesday email that you get, and the link for these recordings should be in there. And then you can listen in your car, if you can plug your phone in, or you can listen at home. Yeah, good.
All right,
Carolyn,
I tried to find it this morning on the SLC site website.
it's a separate one.
It's not there.
Yeah,
Can
yeah.
you put a link on there?
We can, yeah, we can figure that out. Yeah, we can do that. But if you go back to your last Tuesday email, e-news, it's there. Yeah.
Or if you just go to the SoundCloud website and search for my name, it's up there. I have a personal one with my rock songs I've written, and then I have the one that says nutrition music. All good things to listen to.
Cool.
Okay, can we try it? You ready, guys? Let's sing it just the guys once through, and then we'll have the sopranos and altos join us. All right, basses, here we go. Holy, 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 Lord God Almighty, heaven and earth are full of your glory, blessed three in one. Holy, holy. Okay, now everybody else together. Here we go. 1, 2, ready. Holy, 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 Lord God Almighty, heaven and earth are full of your glory, blessed three in one. One more time. Holy, 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 Lord God Almighty, heaven and earth are full of your glory, blessed three in one. Yeah, I like it. The sound is very good. It's very good. Okay, stay tuned for next week. And,
Thank you, Justin. I am actually,
I'm actually going to try that tenor part in the late service.
all right.
But I need some other tenor. Anybody going to late service? Choir will be there, so I won't stick out like a third. Okay, excellent. Thank you. I'd like to just keep singing, actually, rather than delving into this very big and tough. No, just kidding. I'm so excited about this. The Lord be with you. And also with you. Let us pray. Gracious God, let our pondering and our work today give you glory and also be helpful for our faith. In Jesus' name, amen. Okay, so the big and complex question, it can be asked in many different ways, and it might be a little different the way I'm asking it than maybe what was even intended last week, but we'll see. Do we take the Pentateuch? Who knows what the Pentateuch is? Please. What is Penta? 5. Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. Pentateuch. That's the first 5 books of the Bible. You got it. Do we take those studies, especially the creation and the flood, literally? I heard a no and a yes. All right. All right, see there? So let's just begin with the fact that we may have different opinions on this, which is good. Or another way to put it, is Genesis true? In a scientific way, or in the way that we sometimes talk about truth when it comes to science and,
Yes.
testable things.
Yes.
And we got a yes back there.
Yes.
Got a no, whatever, a
When you
maybe.
get over the date problem, then you don't have a problem.
Okay, well see, Bob is already saying it depends on what we mean by a day. Okay, and we'll get into some of this, but these are the questions. Okay, so it obviously depends on what one means by literally. Remember when I was asked the question in the first week we were doing this Bible Basics series, do we take the Bible literally? I said we take the parts of the Bible intended to be taken literally. Yes, we do. And the parts that are not intended to be taken literally, we don't. And I know that sounds like a total cop-out. Have it both ways type of thing. But it's really true. But what do we mean by literally? I think what is usually meant by this question is factually, like history, like I reported to you the events that happened, at worship just a little bit ago, or something like that. Or the American Revolution, telling history, that's, 200 years, but, we still have tons of books being written about it. But we know something happened, and we can tell, we have the record, and we have the basics of what happened. Everything gets interpreted, but we have that. Is that what Genesis is? And then, of course, how does one define truth? In our modern language, we think of truth as factual stuff, like newspaper things. Did it happen? Did it not happen? I've been told that ancient Middle Eastern folks looked at truth. Yeah, did it happen? But truth was much more than just facts. And we're going to get into that. So these are some of the things that come up when we get to this story, or get to this question. But let's make this real. So where the rubber meets the road. I'll never forget a conversation I had in my last parish, probably 10 or 12 years into my ministry. And with just a lovely family. I forget what the one gentleman did for a living, but very intelligent, very smart, very devoted, deeply Christian people, disciples, did more than simply worship on Sunday. They were very involved, and they asked me to come over to visit. They were having some issues with some things. And I went over to talk with them, and this is what he said: Pastor, we're going to be leaving to join the Missouri Synod. And why did he say that? Well, he was saying that because the Missouri Synod takes what would oftentimes be termed a more literal approach to Genesis and to the Bible in general. One of the, if you don't know this, back in 1970, I believe, there was a big blow-up in the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod. For those of you who don't know this, just real quick, Lutherans are in many different strands in the United States. Currently, the constellation is there's the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America, the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod, and then the Wisconsin Synod, Wisconsin Evangelicals. I think that's saying that right. Those three, but then there's the North American Lutheran Church now, which is kind of a break off of the ELCA back in 2010. There's LCMC, which is Lutheran Congregations of Mission for Christ, that broke off in 1990. And so we got lots of strands of Lutheran churches. So there isn't just one Lutheran church. In fact, when the ELCA, our denomination, is in the news, the Missouri Synod folks just cringe because they think that what's being said about the ELCA is being said about them. It's just kind of interesting. Bless their hearts. Okay, anyway, so having said that, this person was saying, we're going to go to a Missouri Synod Lutheran church. And as a pastor, you have families that are just so committed and devoted, it just breaks your heart. They're just the lifeblood of a congregation, as you know. And so I was like, well, why? Tell me what's going on. And now this was a long time ago. This was early on in my ministry. And if you didn't know, back in 1970, the Missouri Synod had a big conflict, and it was called Seminex, because the seminary in St. Louis expelled 90% of the professors. And the St. Louis Seminary was held in that time to be, just the top seminary of any Lutheran Protestant seminaries, actually. And a lot of the issues were, some of the questions that were asked the professors is, was Noah a real person? Or Was Jonah really swallowed by the fish? Did that really happen? These were some of the questions that they were getting at, I'm not going to go into the weeds on what happened, but the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod is just going to say, yeah, we take it. I think a lot of pastors would say the earth was, Bob, not just the young earth people. The earth is 7,000 years old. And these people, were real, factual people. And so this gentleman said, you know what, that's the way I take the Bible. And I know the ELCA, not you, Pastor Bill, but I know the ELCA has a lot of different opinions, and it just doesn't fit anymore. So I said, please, let's talk some more about it. And his position was this. If Adam and Eve and the flood are not actual people and events, facts, how can we believe that Moses or the kings or even Jesus aren't simply creations, human creations too? In other words, what question he was asking is, where do you draw the line? If you say there wasn't really an actual Adam and Eve, but they're just a representative of humanity or something like that. Or if you say that, no, there was kind of a flood, but not really, or, the fish and the Jonah and the whale and all the miracles, where do you start? How do you not take those and take others? How do you pick and choose, is essence what he was saying. And he had a good question. And I had a good answer. But it didn't change his mind. In essence, what he's saying is that an all or nothing proposition. So, how would you respond to that gentleman? What, you expect me to come up with the answer? No, I'm going to make you sweat it out a little bit. Hey, I know some of you have answers. What would you say? You don't have to be a biblical scholar. You don't have to. What would you say to this gentleman? Maybe you'd say he's right. Maybe you'd say, da 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 da. You got round tables, you got square tables. Break up into small groups. You got some people sitting next to you. If you're not comfortable with that, that's okay. But turn and talk in 3 people, or like I see there's a group of 5 in the back there. Turn around, or just go to spend about 5 minutes. Please solve this problem. So what I'd like to do is have us get some help at this point, because we could probably just spend the rest of the 20 minutes, or no, the rest of the half hour we have, just hearing what you came up with. And that's why I was thinking that might be all I would do, because you probably got all the answers that I'm going to maybe propose. But I want to get your blood flowing and get you thinking about this, get you engaged. Let's get some help from someone that I have respected in Old Testament theology and exegesis. His name's Walter Brueggemann. Now, I look at him as a great exegete and Old Testament Hebrew Bible scholar. What he says about other things, I have no idea. I'm just talking about what he has a great commentary on the book of Genesis. And so I want us to read a little bit of some excerpts that I've taken, and I'll talk a little bit about them, and we'll wrestle with them. I don't offer them to you to give you the definitive truth statement, but I think what he says can really help us get at some of the crucial issues. So this is Dr. Walter Brueggemann. He's like I just said, a very influential and very respected Old Testament scholar. Over 100 books, dozens of scholarly articles. He's 85 and he's still preaching and teaching. So that's not old anyway. I mean, look at this guy. All right, so in the beginning of his commentary on the book of Genesis, he says this: comment needs to be made on the matter of creation. world beginnings and attempts to correlate creation narratives with modern scientific hypotheses. No special attention is given to this issue here because it is judged as not pertinent to our purpose. What is he saying? He's saying that that's an interesting question, but that's not the ultimate question or concern of the Pentateuch, or certainly the book of Genesis. Now, he's not dismissing the question altogether, but he's not going to spend a ton of time on it, in other words. But he is just going to talk about it briefly here. The expositor, that's us, must move knowingly between two temptations, he says. On the one hand, there's the temptation to treat this material as historical, as a report of what happened. This will be pursued by those who regard science as a threat and want to protect the particular claims of the text. Why would that be? Well, if it seems like Genesis is saying the earth is only this old, or creation happened in this way, and then we've got other theories, which I guess you could put in the realm of science, but whether it's evolution or other ways of thinking, that contradict. So if we take it literally as what does he say, historical, then we're going to see that science as a conflict. Now, what I want to let you know is that there are lots of people who are looking at science and the biblical narrative and kind of bringing some things together. Like this book here by Hugh Ross, A Matter of Days. The subtitle is Resolving the Creation Controversy. So if this is a big, you might want to read this book. But this author is going to advocate for an old earth and merge, by looking at Genesis in a certain way, what Genesis says and all the things that we're discovering about the cosmos and the earth, and he kind of tries to make a synthesis. But most of the time, people that want a historical Genesis see science as a threat. And in fact, in one of the chapters here, listen to this quote from, Henry Morris of the Institute for Creation Research. Never heard of that? ICR? Come on. He says this: the failure of Bible-believing Christian churches and schools to aggressively defend and promote the true biblical creationism, young earth creationism, is a major cause of the takeover by evolutionary humanism of our entire society. The modern widespread rebellion against God's commandments related to the family is conditional upon the prior rejection of his creation activity record thereof. In other words, that quote, not this book necessarily, but that quote would be an example. Genesis is historical, so science is a threat. This will be pursued by those who regard science as a threat. If these materials are regarded as historical, then a collision with scientific theories is predictable. And again, all I would say to Dr. Brueggemann is that there are people who, that collision, they're trying to make sense of that. They're trying to hold up both of those. Does that make sense? Okay? All right, let's keep going. On the other hand, so that was one temptation. The temptation is just to read Genesis as like history, like fact, like a textbook, like a factor, a list of a newspaper, of just what's the detective show? Just the fact. On the other hand, there's the temptation to treat these materials as myth, as statements which announce what has always been and will always be true of the world. This will be pursued by those who want to harmonize the text with scientific perceptions and who seek to make the text rationally acceptable. So another temptation, he says, is to say, well then, Genesis is not historical. It's like myth. It's like myths of a lot of religions. And I don't say this as a put down of other religions, but they're not necessarily historical. They're stories that get passed on that try and make sense of the world. And just to say, well, that's what Genesis is. It isn't rooted in history. It isn't history. And therefore, since that's true, we can have evolution or whatever kind of evolution we want, And we don't have to worry about some of the miracles back there that they really happened or didn't really happen, because, you know, it's in the realm of myth, and so therefore we don't worry about it actually happening, and so we can harmonize whatever new theories, modern theories there are. And that's a temptation. And there's a lot of you, I bet, that look at Genesis that way. And then there's probably a lot of you that look at it as purely historical, and that's the way it's got to be, or else. It's very possible. So Brueggemann is saying, well, those are both tempting. Okay? Well, what does he say we should do? Our exposition will insist that these texts be taken neither as mystery or history or myth. That's why I love authors that, you know, get to have it both ways. Lutherans are both and people. He's saying, no, let's not go either of those. Rather, we insist that the text is a proclamation of God's decisive dealing with His creation. The word creation is controlling for such a view. The whole cluster of words, creator, creation, create, creature, are confessional words freighted with a particular meaning. What is he saying? He's saying the book of Genesis is a sermon. It's proclamation about who God is and who we are and God's claim on us as human beings and all of God's creation. That's its purpose. Its purpose was never intended to tell people in the 21st century exactly how God scientifically created the world. Or exactly, you know, some of these details along the way. That's its first and foremost function. Now, if you want, well, let's keep going. So what does he say? Does he throw out all of inquiry in this way? The text then is a proclamation of covenanting as the shape of reality. That is God coming to us, making a covenant with us. What's God going to do about our situation? The claim of this tradition is opposed both to a materialism, which regards the world, nature, cosmos, as autonomous. What does that mean? In other words, a lot of people just think we're just material, we're matter, there is no God, there is no accountability, we're just out here on our own. Some people look at it that way, and Genesis says, no way, that's not the case. But it also says that, whoops, wait. I'm not ready yet for that conclusion. Okay, as autonomous and to transcend, say that for me.
Transcendentalism.
Thank you. Which regards the world as the same stuff as God. This is more like maybe a Buddhist. I'm not an expert on different religions, but there is no division between God and matter. God is matter, matter is God. It's called pantheism, I think. So God, there's no division. God is not transcendent. We're theists, actually. We believe God is above everything. Even though God is in with and under everything, God ultimately is not to be equated with matter, I guess you could say. The term create asserts distance and belonging. It is affirmed that the world has distance from God and a life of its own. At the same time, it is confessed that the world belongs to God and has no life without reference to God. Both characterize the relation of creator and creation. He's going on to say, this is what I think Genesis is about. God making a covenant with us. How are we related? God's relationship with us. This is what Genesis is about. So this idiom, and this is it. This is the last quote. This idiom covenant applies not only to the creation stories, but to all the materials of Genesis 1 through 11. The whole is a narrative about God's insistence that creation should be nothing other than His creation. Such a view leaves ample room for every responsible scientific investigation. So if you want to wonder how the Big Bang works with Genesis, go for it. If you want to wonder how does might evolution interface, conflict, or work with, go for it. But it yields not at all on the issue of the fundamental character and reality that is derived from and belonging to this sovereign, gracious God who will seek to have His own way. I'm not sure about this point, if I agree with it, but let me see if I can put it in my words, what he's saying. all the stuff we might find out by this inquiry of merging science with Genesis and asking these questions of historicity, secondary. The main issue is God's claim on humanity. Now the trick is, though, if it gets completely divorced from history, how do we know that the claim is true? That what it says about God's covenant with us is true if some of the details we don't worry about being true? That's just a question I have, and I think I'm going to address it here in a minute. But this theological affirmation permits every scientific view that is genuinely scientific and not a theological claim in disguise. So sometimes people say, well, this is science, but really it's their theological claim that's driving things more so. But you got your head spinning now? Let me try and, having let Brueggemann speak for a little bit, let me try and offer some possibilities. The first thing I'm going to say when we come at this subject is to be careful not to force our modern questions on ancient texts. For instance, when the book of Genesis, inspired oral tradition, gets put together, and we'll talk about the complexity of how it's put together, inspired by the Holy Spirit, given, do you think people, what, 3,000, maybe more, years ago were wondering about the Big Bang? You think they were wondering about how old the earth is, how many days and years? In other words, the people of that time were not asking some of our modern questions. And we want to impose those modern questions on the text, which again, Brueggemann would say, that's fine, just be careful that you don't miss what the thing is really about. Let the text define the questions. Like in the book of Genesis, one of the questions is that people wrestled with, and we still do wrestle with today, is who did create the world? Are we an accident? Are we just the plaything of some other gods? These are still big questions. The book of Genesis says, no, we're not an accident. There is a creator. God created us, each and every one of us, and all that is. That's still an issue. That was a question back then. It's still a question today. I had one person, while I was studying it, it was a Jesuit school, I think in the GTU, Graduate Theological Union, as we were studying this, said, whoever owns the creation story owns the people. So if a creation story, maybe if it's non-theistic evolution, that we're just an example, my systematics professor calls himself a theistic evolutionist. That's not where I'm at necessarily, but that's where he is. But let's say non-theistic, that evolution, we are just completely an accident, and then you have to go read the intelligent design folks that say, you know the odds of us being completely an example? You've got to have a lot of faith to believe that. A lot more faith to believe that there's something more that's kicked things into action, so to speak. But nonetheless, now I probably got lost. But, okay, so, systematics, oh yes, whoever owns the creation story owns the people. So if, as a society, we give up on any notion that we are created by God, not only that we're created by God, but we have certain inalienable rights, which yes, that does come more from deism, but certainly biblically, human life is precious and important. If we give up on the concept of God as creator, if people give up on that, then that creation story, or whoever's story it is, owns the people. In other words, the quote is to say that what you believe about creation has everything to do with how you live, what you think, what you do each day, or not do. Do you do the right thing, whether somebody's watching or not, for instance? I mean, if there is no God, there's no accountability other than whatever laws democracy creates or some dictator creates, then really all you have to worry about is, I just want to make sure I don't get in trouble. I mean, doing the right thing when no one's watching, that doesn't matter, because there's no accountability. So whoever owns the creation story kind of owns the heart of the people. So this is an important issue. I mean, I'm totally with that. But what does Genesis say? It says in Adam and Eve that we are not an accident, that we are created to till and take care of this earth. And then it talks about, why is everything so messed up? Why are there so many problems? It's not so much concerned with where did evil come from, because that's almost an unanswerable question. But it is concerned with, what does God think about it? What is God doing about it? What are we doing about it? What's the state of human beings? These are all issues that Genesis is dealing with. So be careful with your modern worldview of imposing questions on a text that it was never intended to answer. Now again, having said that, we've got, Dr. Peters with Science and Religion here. We've got Evolution's Achilles' heel. We've got this book here that I just mentioned, The Matter of Days, where folks are working with those questions. And again, Brueggemann would say, go for it. Just be careful that you're, and here's the thing that I said, going back to my great guy who asked me that question and went to the Missouri Synod. My concern for him was, what if it was proven somehow that Adam and Eve were not an actual two people, but representatives? I don't know that you could ever prove that. You couldn't. But would your faith crumble at that point? Or if it was proven that creation happened in some way that seemed to conflict with what Genesis said as far as some of the specifics in the first chapter, would your faith crumble? That's my concern with some folks that demand a literal, historical, exacting kind of interpretation. Again, I don't think that's what Genesis was about, and I worry that, then we might have a problem there. All right, I'm going to give you some more. You're going to get a chance to rebuke or rebut me or whatever, or agree with me. Say amen. I'm not hearing any amens yet, but that's all right. Okay, faith is, so this is, now having said that, this is a hugely important point, and why I really appreciated the question. Our faith, the Judeo-Christian faith, is a historical religion. It is an event-driven religion, to use that term, religion. So therefore, at some point, we actually have to insist on the historicity of the events told to us in the Bible. Remember, the gentleman's point was, it's all or nothing. You either got to take it all, or you don't get to take any of it literally. And I say, no, that's not true. I get to do both. But I agree with him in this, that if there was no Moses and no Exodus of the people of Israel out of Egypt, then the Judeo religion is non-existent. And Jews know that. Their number one event, the Exodus. That's the event that shaped them as a people. When they went out from Egypt and Moses had his encounter with God, that's where they were given God's name. This is an event that has to be, something had to have happened. Now maybe the telling of that historical event was shaped to preach, to teach, and wasn't exact fact. I don't know. There's no way to prove it or not prove it. Although they are starting to do archaeology and finding some things that are really interesting. And they're still trying to exactly date when it was, and we have this wonderful enterprise. But then you go on, if there wasn't an Abraham and Sarah before that, if there wasn't prophets, if there wasn't a nation of Israel and kings, and we actually have scientific proof, we even have a little bit of stone that has House of David written on it that goes back to, I think, 800 BC or 900 BC. So we know there was a House of David. That way people are really excited about that, because other than that, all we had was the Old Testament. We didn't even know David existed, supposedly. Although now they're doing archaeology in the old town of Jerusalem, and they found the palace and all kinds of stuff that just dovetails perfectly with a lot of the historical narrative in the Old Testament. So at some point, we have to say, yeah, it happened. Because when we get up to Jesus, there's a lot of people who say Jesus was an invention. The Apostle Paul will say that if Christ is not raised from the dead, each and every one of us is a fool. And we are. If he wasn't raised from the dead.
Amen.
Okay, there we go. There we go. But now the trick is, if we don't, if believing that Christ, if I believe that Christ existed, I believe that what the Gospels tell us is true. I believe he was raised from the dead. Okay, well then what about all these other things? And going back and we get to Adam and Eve. Pastor Bill, on what basis do you take these things as historic events and maybe let go of some of these way back there? On what basis would you do that? And so my answer to this gentleman that I mentioned was that for me, the dividing line comes with Abraham and Sarah. And what Brueggemann and many other authors have said, primeval history to world history. That I don't demand that kind of exacting or insist on the historicity of some of the things that are flood or prior to the flood. And in fact, in Genesis, let's see here. No, that's the wrong one. In Genesis chapter 8, this is a turning point in the book of Genesis. Then Noah built an altar to the Lord. This is after the flood. God makes a covenant. And took some of every clean animal and some of every clean bird and offered burnt offerings on the altar. And when the Lord smelled the pleasing aroma, the Lord said in his heart, I will never again curse the ground because of man. For the intention of man's heart is evil from his youth. Neither will I ever again strike down every living creature as I have done. While the earth remains, seed time and harvest, cold and heat, summer and winter, day and night shall not cease. Brueggemann, many people see this as a turning point in the book of Genesis. I know it is uncomfortable, but God seems to change the way God is going to deal with humanity. God is not going to do what we ask God to do all the time. God, if you're good, why don't you just fix everything? That's the number one reason people tell me they don't believe. They say, you know, I can't believe in this good God you're talking about because this good God is all powerful. And this good God is all powerful. Why does he let all these bad things happen? It's a great question. My only answer is that if God did fix it, it would mean God would wipe us all out. Unless you're perfect. Unless you've never hurt someone. So God has chosen to get God's will done in, with, and through broken and fallible human beings, which included kings and nations. And then culminates with the person of Jesus, where he becomes one of us. That's the extent to which God will go to heal God's creation. I look at the historicity starting with Abraham and Sarah. That's where I just can't. If you're going to say, well, there wasn't really an Abraham and Sarah that God claimed, I mean, that starts in chapter 11 of Genesis, or is it 12? I think maybe it's 12. Yes, we got the Tower of Babel, and another kind of primeval history story. But even there, it starts to get into world history. And at this point in chapter 12 is where I start to get more historical. So that's what I said. I took a half hour to tell that parent, and he still went to the Missouri Synod. No, I'm just kidding. I didn't take that long. Anyway, that's some of my conclusions in my wrestling. I want to hold up in this debate that, why are some of us going to Israel? Because it happened in a certain place, in a certain time. If it didn't, we're all fools. Our religion is different from myth. We might have myth elements in some of our stories, but if it didn't happen, then all bets are off, in my view. So I get why some people get really nervous when it comes to creation. Now, so that's one. So where do I draw the line? Is it arbitrary? A little bit, but I've made my case. Finally, then, some of the problems just get handled in the kind of literature. Like, for instance, the day issue in Genesis. My understanding, when I've listened to rabbis talk about this, the word in Hebrew for day is not, and never was, an exact 24-hour day. That it was a time span. It could be looked at as a time span. So right there, even there, it gives us an ability to say, well, maybe the earth is older than 7,000 years or whatever. Although I've heard some really intelligent people make cases, and I think it's interesting, and I'm, knock me out with all your stuff. I love it. I'm reading, I'm thinking, but even right there. So what kind of literature is it is a big help to this whole debate. Okay? So that's the best I could do. What did you say in your small groups that I didn't say that can help us? And I got my microphone people. Can we get one to Bill and then one to Carissa? Did Justin put it up over here? Yeah, Ken, can you run back to Carissa back to the very back and turn that on? Please.
Some interesting background on Hugh Ross. He's originally from up in Vancouver.
That's this
Canada.
book, Matter of Days.
And also there's a book called Navigating Genesis by Hugh Ross and the Reasons to Believe. But anyhow, when he was in college, he was raised in a family, had no religious background at all, but he got to the point in college, he said, I need to look into this religious stuff, so he's studying different religions. When he got to Genesis, he found that the sequence in that first couple of chapters of Genesis corresponded to exactly what the scientists were finding.
Right.
And he said, no other religion came even close to having the right sequence of things. And, Genesis 1:1 is an exquisite description of the Big Bang. And not only just in Genesis, but also in other parts of Scripture, Job and so forth, about God stretching out the heavens, which was amazing. So he came to become a Christian just by this process.
By this examination of that.
He was a PhD astrophysicist down at Caltech, and then eventually started back in the 80s, Reasons to Believe. We've got a number of the books from Reasons to Believe in the library. It's really helped all of this stuff. And even now we're talking about the Adam and Eve thing. When you're looking back at all the genetic stuff, all the new stuff we're finding out, they actually think it goes back to the original one woman, one man, which would correspond to Adam. So there may be some scientifically valid background for that. So don't worry about the scientific stuff. Keep looking at it. Keep pulling the strings.
So there's an example of, okay, here's the science and here's how it might dovetail well. And again, I'll just put in my quick caution. What happens if we found out genetically that it didn't? Would it wipe out your faith? I hope not, but that's my concern. Perfect. Carissa, the excellent points, Bill. Very helpful.
One of the things I started to think about in this little conversation after small groups was the kind of literature, the way those stories, maybe the Adam and Eve story represents making sense of creation things. If you go to the library and you want to check out a book about Robin Hood, fairy tales, anything like that, nonfiction section. And I just, kind of got thinking about that, like, well, why does that fit? And so, so all those fables and, fairy tales, they teach a moral, they teach a lesson.
Yes.
That is a life truth.
Yes.
These are how we teach our kids.
Yes.
Basic life principles about don't talk to strangers or whatever it is,
Yeah.
But there's truths in those fairy tales.
Yeah.
So maybe that's why they belong in nonfiction, and maybe that's, why this is nonfiction.
Ah. So the Robin Hood, those are in nonfiction?
Yeah, it's Julie.
Oh, interesting.
All the fairy tales are nonfiction.
Please.
So we had a big discussion at our table around what you mean by historicity,
Yes.
and decided that history is often written by the victors.
Yes.
And so, as somebody said, there's an event on the street, and you've got 10 witnesses, you've got 10 different accounts of what happened at that event.
Yeah,
I'm also interested in your premise that maybe it starts with God's covenant with Abraham and Sarah.
yeah.
And if that's true, then what do you do with Jonah and the whale?
Yeah. What do you do with Jonah and the whale? Well, first you decide, is Jonah a story of historicity? Is that its intent? Is it more the, here's a story that communicates certain meanings? And for me, I can let go of the historicity of the Jonah story. But it is after Abraham, it's set in Nineveh, when the Syrians were beating up on the Israelites and whatnot. So that's where I would go to the kind of literature, like the kind of story. And then, yes, so in regard to history, history is told with the perspective. How many textbooks are being rewritten today? Why? Because people don't agree with the perspective it was written from. The Bible is not just telling us bare facts. It is telling us things that happened with theology, with a message. Even Jesus, our stories of Jesus, we have 4 of them. A lot of people think, wow, that conflicts. I'm not going to believe in Christianity because you have 4 different ones. Well, why would you not believe something happened if you interviewed 4 witnesses and they all told the story a little differently? Would you say that must not have happened? Actually, you would probably say it did happen. If they all agreed perfectly, you'd probably say there was collusion. So, I'm serious. This is, when you look at apologetics, you should know that lots of people do not believe in Jesus, do not believe the gospel because they're different. So, but maybe that's a plus. So yes, but the question is did something happen? And that's the trick. Yes, Elliot, please. There's a mic right behind you. Yeah.
I think it's presumptuous to think that God is incapable of metaphor.
Yes, right. Sure, thank you. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, no, and that's poetry. There's so much of the Bible that's poetry, so let's be careful about our demands on the text. Thank you, Elliot. Great. And then Ken, and then we probably have to finish.
I've always thought of Jonah as the story of Israel being swallowed up and being regurgitated again.
Yeah. And see, that story preaches, doesn't it, in so many ways. Now, I want to be very clear. It could happen. It could be an actual event where Jonah was swallowed and spit out. All things are possible for God. If that's a passionate thing for you, fine. There's no way I can prove it didn't. And I think we also have to be careful in our modern, there's a scientific explanation for everything. There is another realm in the Bible, and it is a realm beyond just, what we can explain. And so that's another thing we have to be careful with. So I think there's room to conclude for people with lots of different views here on these questions and on that questions and others. But my challenge is at some point we have to hold on to the historicity of our faith. That this was a people in a time, and something dramatic happened that claimed them, and they had creation stories given them. And yes, if you wanted to look at it, you could see there's a lot of similarities between some of the things in the book of Genesis and other ancient Near Eastern literature. Did those affect them? Was Genesis a counter to some of them? Yes, to answer all those questions. But these are the things that come up. I see one more hand, and then, yes, Betty, and then we'll have that finish us up.
John Sarah was here, but you have to go to Sunday school.
Yeah.
But what John said, and what I think many of us in our group kind of agree to, we don't have trouble with a lot of this, simply because we think it could be a historical distress, however you say the word.
Yeah.
But the Bible, from the beginning to Christ, is what our personal faith story is about.
Yeah.
And in order to have that, we
me use that to finish this way, because we didn't, remember, this isn't something you finish and you're done with. But I think people's concern about these questions is well-founded. I don't appreciate when people say, you know, people who are in a different position have totally left the faith or something like that. I don't think that's helpful. But my concern is, this story that Betty just mentioned has a claim, if it's true. It has a claim on people. Because this says who God is and who we are and what life's about. So that's why questions of historicity, truth, did it happen, are helpful and important. Thank you for wrestling with me with this great subject. Next week we're going to look at some of the different literary traditions in the Old Testament. Not like what kind of literature, but how did the Old Testament get put together? We'll talk a little bit about the New Testament too. Again, this is all trying to help you understand the library that is your Bible. Go in peace, serve the Lord.
Thanks be to God.